today's discussion on why AAPI votes matter, 2024 election and beyond. My name is Early Peng, and I'm a second-year MPP student.
Hi, everyone. My name is Karen Yap, and I'm also a second-year MPP student.
We are both AAPI student fellows at the Ash Center, and I want to begin today with a couple of announcements. Today's discussion is being recorded and will be made publicly available on the Ash Center's YouTube page after the event. There will also be a photographer present today. The Ash Center also acknowledges the land on which Harvard University sits on as the traditional territory of the Massachusetts people. We also recognize the continuing presence of the neighboring Wampanoag and nations.
So as we're entering election season here in the U.S., we'd like to remind those who are eligible to register to vote to check your voter registration status and make a voting plan. We also want to take this opportunity to highlight and let Harvard community members know about the Harvard Votes Challenge, a nonpartisan initiative striving to build a civic culture here at Harvard by increasing voter registration and participation across the entire community. We invite all participants to learn more at voteschallenge.harvard.edu. So joining our panel today is Christine Chen, who is a co-founder and executive director of Asian Pacific Islander American Vote, Saatvik Ahluwalia, who serves as the current vice chair of the AAPI Commission at the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, and Desmond Ang, who is an applied economist and assistant professor at the Kennedy School. This panel is moderated by Archon Fung, the Winthrop Laughlin McCormick Professor of Citizenship and Self-Government at the HKS and Director of the Ash Center. So before we hand it off to Professor Fung, can we give them all a round of applause?
Great, thank you very much, Early and Karen. Thanks everyone for joining us for this lunchtime discussion. Central part of the central mission of the Ash Center is to understand the challenges to creating an equal and inclusive multiracial and multi-ethnic democracy and to figure out ways to advance that objective. And so in light of that mission, this is a great conversation to have, and thank you to the AAPI students and Edward for bringing this together, and thank you guys for joining us today for this discussion. So maybe I'll just open it up with a general question for all three panelists, for Saatvik and Desmond and Christine. So in a New York Times article, I think it was last week or the week before, it's kind of a little bit clickbaitish. It said, will Asian Americans be the swing vote in 2024? And part of the article says Asian Americans are not an enormous group. They make up 4% of the electorate in 2020. Latino voters, by contrast, make up 15%, and Black voters account for 14% of eligible voters. But they have higher turnouts than Asian and Latino voters. So the opening question for all three is, how much do you think the AAPI vote will affect the outcome of the election, either at the national level or in different states? Are there places that are particularly important? And then what are some of the key factors that will drive AAPI turnout or not turnout, will drive people to stay home? Maybe Christine?
Yeah, so thank you so much for this conversation. So what we've seen also just based off of 2020 is that AAPIs are really poised to make a difference as a margin of victory in a lot of these battleground states. Not only from the 2020 census did we see that our population has grown in double digits in every single state except for Hawaii, where we're already a majority, but that has actually translated in terms of more citizens and those who are registering. Back in 2020, I used to say only half of our family and friends were ready to register and turn out to vote, but that increased to 60% in 2020. And we brought in about, overall, the AAPI electorate was 21% were first-time voters. It was higher in places like Georgia at 26%, Nevada 25%, North Carolina 25%. So we're seeing that not only is our community growing, but we're bringing in a new base of voters, right? And with the margins being so narrow, that's where our vote really can make a difference. Just as an example, in 2020, the margin of victory for Georgia for Biden's win was less than 12,000 votes. When you calculate the number of APIs who casted their ballot, and then 26% were first-time voters, when you do the math, it was 3 times the margin of victory, right? So can you imagine if we were not there, what that outcome may have looked like? Especially when you see that, a number of the APIs are more heavily Democrat as well.
So I'm gonna let you mostly talk about some of the bigger picture because you know what's going on. But I will say towards this question, when I was researching for today, I read this Cambridge report from Cambridge University, and it said that in a race where there's an AAPI running for office, not only does it have an impact on AAPIs of their sub ethnicity, but it has there's a pan-ethnic bounce for their turnout. And so I think with Kamala Harris at the top, we'll see, even if it's marginal, these bounces across like the states that you mentioned that can be that tipping vote. Also anecdotally, I have a lot of friends who are Asian who never really got involved in politics. But the day that Kamala Harris became the nominee, I got thousands of texts, not thousands, I don't have many. What felt like thousands of texts flooding into my Instagram, into my phone, being like, hey, Kamala is running, like, how do I get involved? And in particular, a lot of them were from Georgia. And, when Biden was running, I went to Georgia to go knock on doors. And so there's a population growing there that feels that they know how to do this. And at least there, I'm seeing that this less engaged voter is saying, oh, someone who looks like me, who shares my experience in some way, they're running. And maybe they'll be better at steering the way forward than someone who doesn't know what I've been through.
Saatvik, can I ask you a follow-up question on that? So there's been a lot of talk about how Kamala Harris is is kind of running as a generic Democrat because the generic Democrat does really well against Trump in polls, not as a woman or as a South Asian in particular, person of color. And so what do you think about that? And would your advice be to her if she wants to mobilize people in the AAPI community, South Asians especially, she needs to put that part of her identity forward a little bit more? Or do you think, no, she doesn't because it's obvious? And so anybody who cares about that already has all of the information that they need. She doesn't need to talk about it.
It's tough because I think within the larger AAPI community, there might be groups who would go one way or the other. Personally, it's like, she's Asian. Like, you look at her, if I didn't know she was only half Indian, I would just think she's an Indian auntie like anyone else. And I think sometimes when she did that video with Mindy Kaling in 2020, I didn't love it. Like, my wife's South Indian, she makes really good dosa, and the way they were making dosa was not really good. So I think, the electorate, especially in our community, is smart. And they don't want to be pandered to, so it's like, we know you're just do your thing.
Do your thing.
You don't have to try too hard to be like, I'm the Asian candidate.
Well, actually,
Binders full of South Asians.
Right. I have it all. I have one.
So recently our AAPI's survey that just came out in September, we actually did ask about gender as well as your own race and what's most important. Actually, what surprised us was that the biggest issue was actually gender. It was actually more of it. They paid attention more about her gender than in terms of her race, which is interesting because
women and men voters or primarily women?
This is just primarily AAPI voters. Right. And so that surprised us just because as soon as she was declared, there's so much discussion about her race in so many different fashions, right? And so so many of us were commenting about that, but in reality, it was really about the issue of gender. But we're also seeing how that actually impacts the organizing. So a lot of the AAPI organizing, like South Asians for Harris, Chinese Americans for Harris, there's so many different ethnic specific entities are being built out. It's actually led by women. So there is an impact there as well. Yeah, that's, just a little bit of color commentary. I think since 2016 in the United States and around the world, people are talking about what correlates with support for right populism versus more mainstream or centrist or liberal progressive candidates. And people obviously talk a lot about race, right? Racial resentment in the United States, Arlie Hochschild's book, J.D. Vance's book. And then people also kind of talk about education, right? That's super important. Highly educated people used to vote primarily for Republicans. Now that swing is very strongly for
Democrats. But it is true that in many countries, there's a huge gender divide on the populist versus more mainstream vote. And there's a lot, and so why is that? Like in this election, you might think it's about the candidates, but there are deeper reasons too, right? And part of one of the hypotheses is the rise of women in the workplace, educationally, in India, in the family power has really kind of shaken up traditional relationships. And so if you're on the make America great again, make India great again, make Germany great again, whatever it is, gender is going to be a pretty important dimension for you.
I'm gonna add quickly, while she hasn't really leaned into being Asian, she said abortion more than any.
Yeah, like ever.
And I think that plays into the data that you see where it's like, the folks who surveyed said, if there's a candidate who does not support abortion, we're gonna be very iffy of that.
Yeah. Desmond.
Yeah, I mean, I'm gonna mostly defer to the experts here. I think to the point about do Asian Americans matter, I think, it is true that Asian Americans comprise a pretty small share of the population, 4%. That's growing. I think in next election, we're expecting something like 6 or 7.
Wow.
And just because of how Asians come to this country, through means of coming for education, coming for white collar jobs, through H-1B visas, etc., they're often sorting into very specific locations. So coastal cities, big cities across in the Midwest, etc. Not so much into many of these places that we might think of as being swing states, right? And so if you look at Asian American eligible voters in the United States, 88% of them reside outside of swing states, right? And so it is an even smaller fraction when we're thinking about the presidential election in terms of how many Asians are actually going to be influencing that vote. That being said, as Christine said, I mean, the margins are like razor thin, right? Like it's less than 12,000 votes in Georgia. And so almost every electorate matters.
Yeah, every demographic could swing it.
Yeah,
show up or don't show up.
It reminds me a little bit of being tenure track faculty here at Harvard, where I asked a senior colleague, how do I get tenure here? Like, what do I need to be doing in terms of public service, like research, teaching? And he said, everything is marginal. I think that's very much the case for this election as well.
Yeah, cool. Desmond, I wonder, do you have any views about how the AAPI electorate has changed in recent decades? Like, is this a different AAPI? I mean, there are many subgroups, obviously. And so even the category itself, just like the category of Latinos, like, is that really how we should think about it, right? Is because it's sliced up so thinly. So what do you pay attention to? I mean, I think it used to be easiest to kind of lump AAPI into East Asian. Yeah. Now it's like, okay, a bunch of it's South Asian too, and that's really different. Yeah. So how do you think about the different subgroups in this enormous category of AAPI?
Yeah, I mean, it's such a heterogeneous group, both in terms of, country of origin, but then also in terms of duration and the time in this country. And so South Asian specifically are a really crucial part in many of these southern battleground states. So Georgia, I think Indian Americans are something like 80,000 people in the population, which, as Christine mentioned, is really large relative to the margin of victory there. Those individuals are on average here or have been in the United States for a much shorter period of time than East Asians and some Southeast Asian groups like Vietnamese Americans, etc. On the whole, across the entire group, though, I mean, if you look back at the 90s till today, Asian Americans as a whole have become much more Democratic over time, right? So it's gone from something like 50% Democratic to now something closer to 70%. Obviously, there's a little bit of wiggle room. It varies election to election. And so that's just been, I mean, if you look at those trends relative to any other sort of like race group, it's really just been much more divergent.
And why is that? What do we know about why that is?
Well, just even looking at the battleground states, what a lot of people don't realize, like, Indian Americans make up the largest Asian ethnic group in North Carolina, Georgia, Pennsylvania, Michigan, right? Wisconsin is actually the largest community there is the Hmong community. And then for Nevada and Arizona, the largest population is Filipino, right? And so to give you an idea of like the job that AAPI Vote does, like we work with local partners and nonprofits in 29 states. So we just did a translated mailer to 1.9 million households in 23 states. That meant 36 different versions, because for every state we had multiple versions with English and 2 other languages, and segmented out the voter file list. And then that also meant 18 different languages. So depending on who we were targeting in a particular state and who was limited English proficient, that's how we determined. So as I was saying, that at every census, as we continue to grow, our community becomes more diverse. But then as a result, at the national level, we actually have to pivot and make sure that we accommodate all these different ethnic communities. But at the same time, for local campaigns, I say you need to invest in the API community, and it's really easy because there's only certain segmentations of a specific community that you really need to target.
So, just like a little bit more on Desmond's observation of the shift of certainly, my parents, and it was well before the 1990s, were like very studiously independent, and they almost flipped party each presidential vote. Like it was like I couldn't figure it out, right? And now, as you say, API vote is tending more democratic. What do you think? Are there particular drivers of that? Is it education like the H-1B visa people, or are there other anybody like anecdotally or data wise?
There's a couple. So I think one is native-born Asian Americans much more likely to vote Democratic than foreign-born naturalized citizens. And similarly, among naturalized citizens, more recent arrivals are more likely to vote Democratic than early arrivals. And so over this time period, this like 20, 30-year time period, the Asian American electorate has become much more likely to be comprised of, or more heavily comprised of, native-born individuals. So even just 10 years ago in 2014, it was like 35% of the Asian American electorate were native-born. Now it's something closer to 45. So there's sort of like very Asian-specific or immigrant-specific.
Yeah.
There. And then more broadly,
what are those immigrant-specific stories? Is it Democrats are more favorable to new communities and communities of color, or like what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, there are sort of these broader splits that we see, and I think this is what's something that you actually are on, which is that over time, just generally in America, education has been a really big sort of divisive cleavage in terms of what people are voting for, right? So highly educated people are much more likely to vote Democratic. And many of these individuals from the AAPI community, immigrants and their children, are also just disproportionately highly educated relative to any other group.
Some of it might also happen like almost like automatically. As you pointed out, there's a lot of self-sorting geographically. And so if you have a population that's like self-sorting into more democratic areas, and then they're raising their
Massachusetts,
kids, Massachusetts or New Jersey or New York, then their kids are being raised in this context. And even though I'm sure all of us think that our politics are like from us and like we figured out on our own, there's a lot of social context. And so if you're raised in places where the prevailing median value is like more left leaning, it makes sense to me that like, especially for a population that's like skewing towards being highly educated, that you would drift this way over time.
Yeah. Good.
There's evidence of that, causal evidence.
Saatvik, I quite like your Massachusetts experience and kind of serving and working for different AAPI communities. Like, is there a story of participation versus non-participation? So when, African American, Black Americans participate at rates higher than the average and higher than the average white voter. And I think part of that, especially for an older generation, is the civil rights narrative, right? Is like our people fought really, really hard for the right to vote. We've got to show up and utilize that right to vote. Among some Asian, kind of communities, it's been alienation from, certainly the government of the sending country, and sometimes from government generally. I'll just tend to my family or my community or my business, politics, I don't know. Is there, like, what are the narratives of just like participation versus non-participation?
In my experience, I think there's usually like a crisis moment which happens, which spurs some activation. So for me, it was 9/11. I was in 6th grade, and all of a sudden, like, I was the bad guy. I was a terrorist. And there wasn't someone who was like, no, you're okay. And so I think that led me to a path of like, I want to be in a position where like folks can see me and feel safe. And a lot of that is involved.
Interesting.
I think COVID was also one, and we worked together in Texas a lot to like drive activation. And I think the message is that like these things might be
like the anti-Asian part of COVID. Is that
exactly? And so we took that kind of like energy, and I did a lot of census work, and it's like well, what does the census actually do? Like it increases representation, resources, allocation of like the electorate, or rather elected officials. And so when you do the census, that's like a powerful civic decision you make, and it's improving the communities you live in. Like it's safer, you'll have more resources for schools. And so it's kind of like tying this thing together, because otherwise the census is like a big form. And it's like, I don't like filling out forms.
Yeah.
Well,
What are they gonna do with that information?
And that's a big question. It's like, well, will Social Security get this? Like, who can look at it? So I think there's very much like, well, just for younger folks, this is where I'm from. I want to have a stake in it. And so how do I like get on that table or I get a seat? And so politics is one way to do that. Yeah.
And, you know, going back to the breakdown in terms of ethnic communities, even though it's been leaning more Democrat, I would have to say it started because Proposition 187, it was an anti-immigration bill in California that actually drove a lot of Asian American voters to start looking at more the Democratic Party. And I would say starting the 90s, one other thing that was going for the Democrats versus the Republicans was that they started investing in having an AAPI outreach staff member at the DNC. You also saw more AAPIs running for office, and when they won, they were Democrats, right? And it was only like in 2011, 2012 that the Republicans at the RNC decided to actually hire a staff person. So you have a whole generation where the Democrats have been building their infrastructure and staff on that side. But according to our Asian American voter survey, which we conduct every 2 years since 2012, the breakdown that we see, even though they're heavily Democratic, Indian Americans, Japanese Americans tend to be more Democratic, and then Vietnamese Americans and Filipinos tend to be a lot more Republican. For the Vietnamese community, ever since I've been doing this 30 years, the 90s, they always were talking about, the Republicans would say, we're good on communism. So that was like the main message that they would hone in on. But
it's not a random selection of Vietnamese people.
So, but now the survey shows is that there's a shift. Now we actually are seeing, even with the Vietnamese Americans, that they're identifying more as Democrats or independent, right? And so you're seeing that change also in Orange County, and that's why Orange County now, the 2 congressional races there are really tight, and they're looking at as a purple area.
Right. For people who are interested in Orange County, you should read The Sympathizer and watch the show.
I'm gonna pull on one thread you mentioned, which is voter contact. I did a lot of field work when I was younger, and often just like knocking on that one door, you have to see that vote, because so many in our community never get a single knock on the door. I worked for Cambridge Leland Chung, who is an alum of this school, and we were the only folks who went to like the apartments, which were mostly AAPI, and like those seniors were like, okay, like you look sweet, you have a nice little and like when you came to
nice.
Leland was nice, and he had a very cute daughter, which also helped. With culturally competent snacks to the apartment, and they're like, yeah, we'll vote for you. We're gonna vote for you.
That's great. So on the partisan trends, there's been a lot of reporting about how both Latino and African American communities in the U.S. tilt strongly Democratic, but somewhat less so in 2024. Like some of that vote is going to Trump now more than in 2020 or 16. And there's a lot of speculation about that. Maybe it's normalization. Maybe it's a slice of those communities are working class, and Trump has greater appeal to working class people than either Biden or Harris. Is there any similar trend in the AAPI community of strong Democratic support as a baseline, but somewhat weaker than in the last couple of cycles, or that doesn't hold as it does for African? Do we know?
Well, going back again to our September survey, in comparison to what our survey that we did earlier this year, Harris is now at 66% support and 28% is for Trump. So that's actually been an increase because earlier this year.
For Harris or for Trump?
For Harris.
For Harris.
For
Okay.
Harris is 66%.
Yeah, gotcha,
right?
gotcha.
But earlier this year, when it was Biden versus Trump, right? Biden was still up by 15 points, but he was 8 points lower than 2020.
Oh, I see.
But Harris was able to not only increase and pick up. So now she leads by 38 points, right? But obviously there's still like some variations. And I think it goes back to whether or not our community is going to be as motivated as 2020 to actually turn out. So what we are seeing is that maybe the levels of support for Trump is sort of similar, but whether or not those independent voters are they going to be motivated?
Are they going to
actually
show
turn
up on election day?
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So this is a big question for all three. What do AAPI voters want? And let me parse that out a little bit. One is you could be thinking, oh, identity is really important, whether it's the identity of the candidate or the public policies that are going to benefit me as an Asian American, right? So that's the identity one. There are kind of values fights, like is democracy on the line? Is it abortion and pro-choice or pro-life, right? And then a third kind of lumpy bucket there is kitchen table issues, is economy issues. So how are you feeling the balance in the AAPI community? And is it different from other demographics as far as you can?
So jobs and economy and healthcare access continue to be the bread and butter issues.
Oh, just like everybody else.
Just like everyone else, but whether or not they're being reached out to, right? Going back to where the campaigns and the candidates doing to actually talk to the community really will make a difference. But we also ask, is there a single issue that that if that candidate is against your values on XYZ, what would that be that would prevent you from voting for them? It's actually racism and discrimination. And then right closely after that, it was abortion. And so it's really a combination of looking at that in terms of how our API voters are thinking, but also a lot of our voters are thinking down ballot as well. A lot of our local partners are focusing on down ballot education and also making people understand what different parties and different candidates are standing for.
Yeah, just to build off of that, and something I thought that brought up earlier, which is in 2020, Asian turnout was actually much higher than it was, even as a share of eligible voting population. So it went up by 20%, from 49,
Wow.
I think, percent turnout among eligible voters to 60%.
Wow.
And that's true. I mean, many demographic groups went up with Trump. And,
Yeah.
That's the largest.
Yeah, that was the largest. Yeah, for sure. And I think it gets back to something Saatvik brought up, which was that during COVID, there was a lot of anti-Asian, rhetoric and all that. And a lot of my research looks not at Asian communities, but at Black and Hispanic communities, and this idea of institutional targeting, discrimination through things like police violence are very much mobilizing for these communities.
Yeah.
I think that to your point as well, which is
9/11.
this sort of triggering event
Yeah.
where all of a sudden I feel targeted in a way that really activates me in some sense. And I think 2020 was part of that. I think sort of what Christine is saying now, perceptions of discrimination is something that we really seem to care about in terms of who we vote for. And if you just look at this, is even pre sort of COVID, all of that. If you look across demographic groups in terms of how salient is race to different race groups, right? Like how salient is our experiences of discrimination. Asian Americans are as likely to say that they've experienced discrimination as Black Americans.
Is that recent?
That was 2019.
Compared to do we know in the past were they less likely to say that then?
No, so I think that this is even sort of saying even pre-COVID, right?
Yeah.
So
I
in
see.
2019, Asians are saying race and discrimination is something that's just really salient to me.
Yeah.
It's a really big part of my identity as well. In a way that perhaps people don't necessarily think of when they compare it to sort of Black or brown individuals.
Yeah.
And then I think with 2020 we saw this really heightened sort of anti-Asian rhetoric that seemed to motivate some individuals. There's some correlational analysis that suggests that as well.
Interesting.
And I think what Christine brought up from the surveys really kind of points to that as well.
What are the trying to think about how to ask this? If you're an African American, one of the archetypical experiences of discrimination is engagement with police, right? So do you think that there are archetypal experiences of discrimination if you're AAPI or in particular AAPI subgroups? What are people thinking about either for themselves or that's happened to them?
So Stop AAPI Hate recently came out with a new report that since the Israel-Gaza conflict, there's
Yeah.
actually been more increased discrimination and hate incidences with South Asians. So that's happening. Also, the last few years, the state legislators, especially in Georgia, Florida, Texas, introduced a alien land law, which essentially says that
That's
if
just an ethnic and racial confusion, just
It-
like I think you're Palestinian.
yeah, well, you know, hate is hate.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
But so in regards to the alien land laws, if you're a Chinese immigrant, they're targeting saying that you would not be eligible to purchase a home or any real estate, right? And so that has actually galvanized this new base of Chinese immigrants that in the past was not organizing because they were fighting that. And you probably could talk a lot about that in Texas. And as a result, now they've been coming to us saying, how can we organize for the elections? Because we know that we need to turn out to make a statement because this issue is not going away. It's going to be introduced to other other states as well.
Yeah.
So we actually have friends in Texas right now who are testifying against these alien bills, and they've been doing it for like,
So can you
Yeah.
say a little bit more about what the content of the, I mean, I don't know, and other people in the audience might not know.
So-
Yeah. How's it work?
it happened after I left, but here's the gist of it, that these foreigners are coming and they're investing and they're like driving up housing costs and getting all the farms, and we don't want that to happen. So the
It's a
idea,
national security risk.
right, because, you know, the scary communists are gonna come, take all of our farm, take all the food back to China, and we're gonna starve, or, you know, whatever thing they're putting up in their head. But the impact then is you're seeing increase in like negative stereotypes being spoken, like on TV and social media by elected officials who are positions of authority. But also like this bill is, you know, it's like specifically targeting a specific group of people. And I think to that, your question about threads, the thread is that like, you know, like I was on a watch list since I was like 13 years old. Like I got searched every time I went on an airplane. And it's just the idea that like, we're always this other person. Like you shouldn't be able to buy a house because like you might be a foreigner, or like don't go on the airplane because you might be a terrorist even though you're 14 years old, or whatever all this stuff is. I think that's like very galvanizing to say, I don't want to be an other. And like, how do I like what are the things that Americans do? Like they get involved in politics, they vote, they do the census, they organize. And so like, maybe if I do those things, I'll stop being this like outside category.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting to think about what what the forms and conceptions of how discrimination and exclusion work that are kind of specific to the AAPI community and different from others. So, you know, when was this? You guys will know much better than me. The fight around California and San Francisco and the elimination of testing as entry to magnet schools is like, I think my intuition is, well, a lot of AAPI people in the region, in the area got worked up about that because meritocracy was this like thing that enabled inclusion and fairness. And now you want to take that away. And now it's just going to be, you know, these like implicit, you know, networks that we're not in that will channel people to these opportunities. And, you know, so
that's like one of those interesting cases where like, we're not all a monolith.
yeah.
And at least like when we had a similar kind of conversation here in Massachusetts a few years ago, it was like there were certain, mostly like Chinese immigrant families who were like very pro testing.
Yeah.
Like a lot of other Asian populations were like, no, this doesn't help because again,
Right.
across
In Lawrence, it's probably not really helping.
right,
very much.
exactly. So it's like
Yeah.
maybe there's some negative to some parts of our
Yeah.
pan-ethnic group, but a lot of us like don't come from that like upper middle class,
Yeah,
highly
yeah,
educated,
yeah.
white collar thing. It's like,
Right.
well, these tests don't help us. So it's
Right.
like it like does create some equity, but like in different kinds of ways.
Right. I mean, it's different conceptions of equity, right? Yeah. It's like a fight about what fairness
Exactly.
is. Yeah. Very cool. All right. So engagement and mobilization, what is effective? What do you think is effective and less effective in reaching out to AAPI communities of different kinds to encourage them to participate in the political process? And are those techniques specific to AAPI or the same things that work for AAPI communities or what you should do for every other community?
Well, you know, it goes back to 2/3 of our community to continue to be first-generation immigrants, and a segment of that is going to be limited English proficient,
Yeah.
right?
I got you.
And so, also as a new immigrant, you're also coming from different countries because AANHPI is very, very diverse, right? It's an American construct, and so they're also coming with different cultural baggage in terms of what it means to be involved with democracy or with the elections, or whether or not you should or should not participate. So, so for us, it's always about how do we, yes, take the same models that everyone else does in regards to voter registration, education, GOTV, phone banking, text banking, door knocking, right? All those type of things, but do it in a culturally competent way that will resonate with the community, meet the community where they're at, because different ethnic communities are going to be organized in different ways, right? The Hmong community is very different and in terms of how they are organized versus the Chinese community or Indian community, even in terms of like social media and what's the different platforms they're on, right? If for us, I have folks in the Chinese community that are, you know, part of the WeChats. We have the Indian community that's on WhatsApp. We have Korean community that's on Kakao, right? So as you can tell, like my colleagues don't envy the work that we do at APIO because we actually have to be on so many different platforms that are local partners,
first of all,
right? And also to make sure that we have translated material. So we invest a lot of our videos, our digital ads, our mail, all in language. And then we also hire phone bankers that also have the language capabilities. And we run a 888 API vote hotline. So that way, when people start having issues, they could call us and we could provide them with the in-language support as well.
So is it mainly social? There's no AAPI kind of real analog to Univision or?
So we found them across the states. I've lived in Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, but they're like very niche. So like I grew up here and there's Indian New England. It's a newspaper that goes across New England, which is specific for like South Asians. And you wouldn't just like find it if you.
No, I wouldn't. Didn't know about it until
Right, exactly.
2 seconds ago.
I think in a lot of our communities, especially with, as you said, there's a lot of like still first generation immigrants. They created these like little ecosystems of media that weren't on social. So that there could be like a radio station. And it's like, how do you like? It's the same tactics you'd use for any other population, but just way harder because they're kind of like almost
The social isolation or the
Right.
kind of whatever, the distance, social distance. And,
Yeah.
But there are ethnic press. So like in 2020 census, we got a grant to actually invest in ethnic press that the US Census was not. And so that's where we actually utilize our community partners to really find out where are the ethnic press as well as informal press that's online that people are not necessarily paying
That's
attention to,
interesting.
right? So that's why it always is about, yes, there are certain things that the government and others will do, but we actually have to take that next layer because they only are hearing so much. But we actually need to better understand where our communities are, especially as they're growing and new populations emerge. That means that's a new infrastructure, new way of communicating that we need to meet them where they're at.
That's it. So, I mean, under any circumstances, linguistic competence is absolutely critical. But it sounds like you're saying, first of all, generic Facebook ad buy ain't going to cut it because you don't understand where the media ecosystems are that are specific. And then what about ground game, door-to-door canvas? Is that like, what percent, is that as effective as it is for other communities or less so? You got to rely more on social, less on ground game. What's the balance?
It depends on where you're at, right? Because it's about density, but that's why for us, we're trying to raise more money for certain states like in Georgia and Nevada, where they were able to hire door-to-door canvassers. It's a lot harder, but they know that when they're able to finally get to someone at the door to actually have a solid conversation, that's going to be a lot more meaningful and hopefully to also push back on mis and disinformation that they see, right? Or at least to hopefully that they'll remember the conversation and will like when they see some mis and disinformation, maybe they'll hold back and ask more questions before just readily accepting it. But it's a lot of work.
Good, right. Do you any of you have a sense of whether because they're in different media ecosystems that are somewhat isolated, are there different kinds of misinformation and are the communities more vulnerable to misinformation as some other kind of more discrete communities are?
I don't have an answer to that. I do want to add some context to all the work that Christine's doing in Saatvik as well, which is the reason why these advocacy groups are so important and filling such a need, which is what Christine mentioned, is that there is this gap between what the federal government does and what we might think is actually useful to actually getting people to turn out. And a lot of that traces back to 2013, the Shelby versus Holder case that overturned a huge part of the Voting Rights Act. And allowed many sort of historically racist areas to then do whatever they want in their election laws and rules. And I think a lot of the media has been focused on sort of these big, sort of like very strategic redistricting policy, things like voter IDs. But the whole reason why we had the law, which is like very prophylactic, was that election officials can essentially do whatever they want, right? They can determine where polling stations are, how long they're open. They can determine things like registration requirements, like who can actually
languages
put
are
them,
translated into.
what language gets translated, etc. And so as a result of that, I think, you know, there could be tons of things going on that we just have no measure of in terms of how those are impacting these smaller communities. And to that point about sort of translated materials, the Voting Rights Act, and this is a part that I don't think was struck down in Shelby, it requires counties to translate election materials, right? But to do that, there has to be the minority group has to comprise a certain share of the.
Oh, right. Okay.
I believe it's something like over 5%
5%.
of the citizen
10,000.
voting age.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
And and Asian Americans are a really small group, and we're also broken up into many other subgroups as well.
Right.
And so in many of these circumstances, in all the battleground states, I think besides Nevada, Asian Americans comprise less than like 4% even.
Oh, right. So you might not
Actually,
hit that
no.
threshold, but
So
still
like,
be.
we have section 203 covers like Bengali in Michigan.
Yeah.
And actually in Georgia, Korean, in one of the counties. And so we're actually are growing. The people just don't realize it. That's why I'm always excited when I get the census numbers, because I get to see what other counties are actually included in section 203.
So you actually need like segregated enclaves actually to reach that threshold for any given group, right? Like if we're just diffused across Georgia that has 4% everywhere, like there would be no translated materials at all, right?
And so this was like one of the key points you brought up in our census effort is that like, if you want your family and friends who don't speak English as first language to be able to vote, like you need to sign this, because then when you do the census and the population changes and they say, okay, we have to translate it in XYZ, that's giving you
That's
greater
good for
access.
everybody,
to
yeah.
participation.
Yeah. Good.
But going back to mis and disinformation, so yeah, it's like every 4 years, it seems like there's something new that we actually have to address. And so this time we actually have a team of actually have staff now that's solely focusing on monitoring mis and disinformation. We actually sub-granted to 5 different states where they are able to hire staff to actually specifically work on that with different communities in their local area. And a lot of what you're hearing around mis and disinformation is trickling into these different platforms, right?
Sure.
So so right now the big trend, I was just looking at our most recent report this week, is that it's all about the number of immigrants who are not non-citizens who are supposedly voting, right? That whole narrative is being pushed out there, especially within our communities.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, right.
Or the question about whether or not early voting and mail-in ballots, you know, whether or not it'll be disqualified, that whole narrative, which actually would hinder us because 2022, 73% of our community voted early or by mail. So that's the most preferred way in comparison to any other ethnic community to actually be able to cast their ballot.
Yeah.
And so if there are narratives saying that this is not, you know, maybe your vote won't be counted and it's going to discourage people to actually take that route,
Participate at all, yeah.
that they may not necessarily participate,
Yeah,
right?
right. Wow.
So it's those type of things, but once again, then we actually have to like also try to be proactive, like what are some narratives that we think may emerge? And we're already starting to prepare for that for even post elections. So we're trying to create in-language videos and in-language graphics and start presenting those narratives and pushing that out there into those spaces just to be proactive and counter what may be coming later on.
Just to add to this, you know, you need to have the materials and the knowledge that this is disinformation. But I think in our communities, you need to also know like who are those sources of truth, which is why continuous investment is important. So if you show up every 4 years and like, okay, they're like, well,
Who are you?
Tell me.
Yeah.
A video of me won't help convince somebody in like Nebraska that XYZ is not true. But like when we did our census and GeoTV, in part thanks to the funds that they gave us, is like we found all these like whether it was a business owner, a baker, we actually had someone from Indian Matchmaker who was like an influencer person.
Very important person.
Very important. We found these like sources of truth that like even small pockets of the community trusted in, and then they were the best messenger for like this misinformation is like, well, this is misinformation,
right.
and this is the truth. And if you don't have that, you can't like build that trust that like you're on, you're doing something that's beneficial for the community.
Right.
And I think that's why the model for us is that we're not here once every 4 years or once every 2 years. That's how we're different from campaigns because they pack up and they're gone, right? We're in it to actually invest every single year to build up organizations, whether it's in Texas or in Nevada. And so if it's a volunteer-based organization, if it's a social service agency, it's about how do we embed civic engagement and education into their work every day of the year. So then that way, when it's time for them to talk about the elections or whatever, they're a trusted messenger, right? And they've already been fed or educated about all this. And also just to reemphasize that elections also may happen every single year. I'm in Virginia, so I have to vote every single year because there are local elections that are just as important, especially coming out of 2020 with the rise of anti-Asian violence. One of the solutions that people realize is that we need to try to push for diversification of education K through 12, right? To include AAPI history and other multicultural history and curriculum, right? So there's a lot more movement to actually do that, but that means you have to influence city council and school board, right? And so that's why local elections are just as important.
Yeah, good. So last round of questions and then we'll open it up. Just looking forward into the future beyond 2024, maybe to the 5-year, 10-year time frame. Give me the half empty and half full parts of what you're hoping for and what you're concerned about. And I'll just do mine. I'm hopeful that more API people are participating in politics and both as voters, but then also as candidates. That seems very positive. And the thing that I'm concerned about is actually something we haven't talked about except 9/11 is the global scene. I guess I'm worried as tensions heat up between the US and China, especially, it's not going to be good for the East Asian part of the AAPI community, and that may spill out more broadly.
I think there are reasons to be hopeful. I think we saw this. It was 2016, 2020, where these are really polarized elections. But one really good thing that came out of it is that people are really engaged, right? And I think we, relative to other Western democracies, have such low voter turnout. Even at the national level, of federal, presidential elections, but even more so, as Christine was mentioning, all these local elections that we have, right, where turnout is just abysmally low, right? It's like 20%, 25% for Asian Americans, I think, in elections prior to 2020. And I think we just need people to be out there and voting, right? Like, I think there's lots of evidence. The more people are voting, expansion of the franchise, etc., like that just leads to policy that's more representative of people, regardless of the race or gender or political affiliation of the candidate who wins. Like, more people voting leads to more representative policy, and I think we're really far from that. Historically, we're still very far from that, but we are getting closer to it. Maybe under sort of suboptimal conditions of just like a really high polarization. Nonetheless, like people are being engaged with things.
Silver lining, maybe.
Which is good. I think the flip side of that, I think polarization is a really big deal. I think the intersection between that and misinformation and AI, like, it's just very unprecedented, and I don't really know what that looks like going forward.
After I graduated, I kind of drifted away from AAPI organizing for a little while until 2020 and the Stop Asian Hate. And I wrote an op-ed during the time being like, when I was 13, I faced this kind of hate. And then 20, 30 years later, it happened again. And so kind of my hope is like in 20, 30 years, I don't have to do this again. Like, we don't need this panel. And a big part of that is like, I hope, as you're saying, like, we just like turn up, and the more we turn out, we elect more folks who look like us. We elect for policy holders who will take our concerns seriously, and we make it so that we're not an other. And so, like, I have a 3-year-old, and I don't want her to write an op-ed when she's 15 or 20, being like, "Oh man, like, there's a war with China, and like now everyone who looks like me is getting bullied and attacked and whatnot." And I think as our share of the electorate grows, and we feel that power that like we can make a marginal difference or a real difference, like across any elected elections, like, we start owning that we are also Americans, whether we're immigrants or whether we were born here. Like, we're here. And this is our country. I'm not gonna go to India. Like, I don't want to live in India. This is the only place.
You're home.
My home. This is the only place that I have. And so, as we grow in population and in political voice, that we just are able to start overcoming this like repetitive cycle of you are not from here. You don't belong here. Hey, where are you really from? Like, I don't want my daughter to be asked that question. I think that can started in 2020, and I think we're just going to keep building towards it. And the pessimistic outlook is that I don't know, they like sign a bill and we're just getting sent, we're getting deported. Even though
That's
we're not.
no, that one's hard.
And that is pretty dark, but. So, but I'm a very optimistic person. So
Don't spend too much time on that one.
I don't want to go on a negative.
Yeah. So, I always remind everyone that in 2020, what the Asian community experienced was not something new, unfortunately, right? I know for myself, and even within my history, in the 80s, the killing of Vincent Chin by 2 auto workers because we're in the middle of the whole US versus
car.
Japan car auto industry fight, right? Competition, and how that resulted in how our community then actually galvanized together to actually realize like hate is hate, and that to actually even come together as an Asian American community, because before then that concept really had not really solidified, right? And then years later, then you had 9/11, but then it was also another opportunity where before 9/11, the South Asian community never had like a AAPI civil rights advocacy organization or infrastructure, right? So that was also an opportunity. So with every struggle, I sort of feel like there's been an opportunity for us to continue to build. And even with 2020, it was just like, finally, a larger segment of our community is leaning into their own into their own ethnic background, and understanding that they can't not escape that, regardless of their economic status or where they live, right? And so we see a lot more engagement, whether we saw that in terms of the elections or even more API institutions being built. So I feel like we're in a better position as we encounter, I hate to say it, yes, the whole US-China, we've actually been having a number of conversations about how is that going to look like even next year. Some trends that we're seeing where we as a community need to like figure out what's a better way of trying to pivot, or like making sure that we redirect how that conversation is going. But that also is tied into whether or not we're going to come out and vote this election cycle and put us in a better position. So I'm really hopeful with that, especially since right now only less than 1% of our elected officials are Asian American. So we continue to increase that, but we still have a long way to go with that. But what we have seen even this last decade with API vote being able to build up our resources and to subgrant to local groups is that these local jurisdictions where they're increasing voter participation, we're also seeing an increase of APIs running and winning their elections. So to give you an example, typically California has always had the largest number of API state legislators, minus Hawaii, okay? Georgia now has 11 API state legislators. Nevada has 7. Minnesota has 10. 9 out of the 10 state legislators in Minnesota are Hmong, right? Even this election in Wisconsin, the largest ethnic community, like I said, is Hmong, and they actually have a candidate who's running for the state assembly as well. So we're seeing that movement when we have increase of voter participation, but then it's also translating in terms of elected officials. In terms of what I'm worried about, actually, it goes back to mis and disinformation. That infrastructure it seems like it's getting worse every cycle. And so even after this election cycle, we know that we're still going to have to deal with that in terms of not even if it's not about this election, it's about how we talk about issues and how we even frame and view people. So
that's great. Thank you very much. We have a few minutes for questions. Yeah, please.
Hi, thank you all so much for your talk. I'm Sarah. I'm a first-year MPP student at Robert Kennedy School. I thought it was very interesting to hear about like your takeaway about like Kamala Harris and Minnie Kaling's kind of show, because I don't know, it felt like we have had a lot of presidential candidates who, in my opinion, have like rejected or decided not to talk about their Asian Americanness. I'm thinking like Bobby Jindal and Nikki Haley, even Andrew Yang to a degree, didn't really embrace that side of them in their campaign. I was wondering if y'all can maybe speak to a little bit about maybe is that a larger kind of, when they're thinking about a national run, is that on purpose?
Only 4% of the electorate.
I will say that at least in terms of the campaign, especially this time around with Harris, they've been very intentional. I've seen more millions of dollars being put into Asian ethnic ad buys I've never seen in the past. And then also the creation of all these volunteer-based, like ethnic specific volunteer organizations like Chinese and South Asians and all the other ethnic communities, that has actually really grown. And then on top of that, they've also hired AAPI staffers in each of the battleground states as well to implement specifically a program focusing on the AAPI community. So, so at least this round, I'm actually quite pleased in seeing like how overall there's just been a lot more engagement overall and investments.
I think context matters. So that video was during the primary where it's like, you're definitely trying to like just get your base to like, be like, okay, I like you. Whereas now she's didn't have a primary and she doesn't have to like pander in the same ways to like a smaller group because like in a primary, it's a little bit easier to like have a small group like push you over the edge because there's like, it's crowded. Yeah, I mean like, she doesn't deny that she's Asian and that's all I really like. I don't want someone who's like gonna deny it, but you don't have to like, I don't need to lean into it too hard because like it's very self-evident that she's Asian.
Also, I would say
it's a tricky like political tightrope, right? Like I think if you look across history, even going back to Civil War and Jim Crow that followed, like racial backlash is just such a real thing. Like every sort of like racial movement that we've had, every sort of racial step of progress, there's always been sort of a counteracting force. Right? There's empirical evidence about having Black candidates run. Does that increase turnout? And you see that increases Black turnout, but also equally increases white turnout against those candidates. And so in that world, like how much do you want to be leaning into something, especially when Asian Americans are present? Right.
And from a leadership perspective, I mean, as you say, everyone walks that tightrope in a different way. Like Obama did it one way, Harris is doing it in another way. Andrew, I don't know, but
But also, if you look at San Francisco, if you ask the San Francisco voters, they're like, oh no, she has a Chinese name because there's a huge Chinese population in San Francisco. So she leaned in her Asian American background in that community.
Other questions?
Real quick.
Yeah.
It's complimentary to the question. What about in terms of the ecosystem? What about the AAPI victory funds or PACs? Well, what is their role? Have they grown in size and influence? And the second thing is, are they more coordinated? Meaning, is there something there? Are they really working with these organizations and pouring money into something that we could call a movement or at least much more sophisticated, high resources?
So
money.
Yeah, so it goes back to in the last decade, there's been a lot more. First, we were able to get a funder with the Wallace H. Coulter Foundation. They actually funded the C3s, the nonpartisan nonprofit organizations. By the time they sunset this year, they would have invested about $250 million into our community. So that actually helped us establish a baseline and infrastructure for the community, not only for getting out the count for the census, but also getting out the vote for the elections, right? As a result, those same C3s in battleground states, starting like in probably 2016 or so, they created C4 entities. So that way and some states like in Georgia, those same entities create C3, C4, and political PACs. And as a result, then we're also starting to see a lot more just political PACs, right? So that has grown. When I first started like 30 years ago, the AAA fund was our first ever Asian American PAC, right? But now you see the AAPI Victory Fund, they're raising a lot more money, trying to be a similar entity with the Latinos and African Americans doing some things together, right? So I would say every election cycle in the last decade, our ecosystem has actually become a little bit more sophisticated, a lot more well-funded. It's still a lot less than most places, most ethnic communities, but we're making headway.
I'm afraid we're out of time, but thank you very much, everyone, for joining this discussion.